So do you want to move on to the next part there? Yeah. So the goals today are to define social isolation as well as loneliness and to report the impact of this on residents and staff. We want to talk about how the pandemic creates psychological trauma or pre-trauma, if you will, and also to look at the screening tools for identifying social isolation in particular and post-traumatic stress. And so the idea is that these videos are going to correlate the condition of the pandemic with basically disaster planning. And then we want to look into the quality improvement solutions for fighting social isolation. So next slide, please. So we're going to have just to start off with this PowerPoint, and then we're going to move into the video. This is delivered by the IHI content expert, Paige Hector, who has a consulting company in social work. And then we're going to get back to another PowerPoint on resident engagement. We'll have some questions and answers and responses, and then we'll move into a case presentation with Kelly Marks, and then just wrap it up from there. Next slide, please. Okay, so if we can get the video launched here, that would be good.
Hello and welcome to the webinar titled Social Isolation During a Pandemic and After. My name is Paige Hector. I will be your speaker for this session. When I was asked to prepare this topic, as I often do, I become curious. I start thinking, well, what is the nature of the problem? What is it that we are really dealing with, and how might we go about some ideas for improvement? So much like this little guy here, I just love this image with his little magnifying glass and looking so intently. That's what I feel like, well, what really is the problem that we're dealing with here? So I ask a lot of questions. So isolation, social isolation, well, what is it exactly? Is it a new problem? Is it an ongoing or something different problem? What are the contributing factors, and what resources do we have to address it? And what else do we need? First, I'd like to take you on a quick side trip. I'd like to introduce you to my sister, Shannon. Shannon's a high school special education math teacher, and we often talk about the similarities between education and healthcare. So I recently asked her to make a list of the challenges that she faces as a teacher. Sometimes I find it very helpful to step outside of my world of healthcare and long-term care and look at ideas from a different perspective, through a different lens, so to speak. Well, here's my sister's list. So as a teacher, on any given day, she is dealing with technology challenges, as all of us are, fatigue and burnout, herself, her kids, her children, the children's families, issues around housing and food insecurity, so the social determinants. There's a lot of issues here, and many of them overlap with healthcare. And the analogy I want to make here is, well, all of these impact her ability to provide the best education to her students. Would we expect her or any teacher to solve all these problems? Well, of course not. That would be ludicrous to think that, right? And it's the same idea with our nursing homes. We have so many issues going on right now, so many factors and challenges. There is not one administrator or director of nurses or a leadership team, medical director. There's not one person individually that can solve all of these issues. What we can try to do is make a difference. So let me delve a little bit more deeply into our world of healthcare. So in May of 2019, Dr. Nazir, the immediate past president of AMDA, he wrote a wonderful article, and I love the title, "No One Cares When Planes Don't Crash." And he listed things much like the list that I just showed you with my sister. This is an abbreviated list of certain: rising patient acuity, disproportionate reimbursement, dissatisfaction and turnover as a result, it impacts quality of care, and other things that adding to the discouragement and demotivation of staff is the survey process and focus only on deficiencies, media reports, and boy, aren't there a lot of those right now. negative processes like legislative hearings and lawsuits, of which I think we're just beginning to get a flavor of in this pandemic space. Everything focusing on mistakes. There's nothing that says, look at the wonderful care. There's very little, or maybe there's going to be more of those stories coming to light. The wonderful care, the good things that are happening in our nursing homes. So point out the data again, May of 19. This list from Dr. Nazir was before the pandemic, so we can certainly add a whole list of things related to this added complication. Social isolation is certainly one of them, but again, there's not one person that can solve all of these together. In the history of post-acute and long-term care, there has never been a time that we have needed to come together more than we do right now, because individually we do not have the bandwidth to address all these issues. It's going to require multi-level strategies and collaboration, just like what IHI is doing in conjunction with the ECHO Institute to bring these webinar series to you. So we can still affect change. At the micro level, individual residents and families, we can screen for trauma. Providers can screen for trauma. If we identify residents that are at risk or highly or experiencing trauma, we can refer them for in-depth assessment and treatment when necessary. At the facility level, which I call the meso, the middle level, it's a facility commitment to operationalize trauma-informed care principles, to train and mentor and coach staff engaging in these practices of trauma-informed care. Collaborating with professionals, so when we identify residents that are at risk of or being traumatized, that we have a host of experts that we can engage and get involved to help these residents, because very few post-acute and long-term care facilities will have that resource in-house, that level of training and experience and expertise. Ultimately, what we're trying to do is achieve sustainable culture change, not just change related to the culture of the pandemic. The definition of emotional and psychological trauma is the result of extraordinarily stressful events that shatter a sense of security and we feel helpless. It often involves a threat to life or safety, but really it's any situation that leaves the individual feeling overwhelmed and isolated. And the more helpless or frightened one feels, the more likely they are to be traumatized. Adding to that is the work of Dr. Van der Kolk. He's a psychiatrist and trauma researcher, and he talks about the virus being a pre-traumatic condition based on two core variables. Number one, immobilization, literally the inability to move around, being quarantined or sheltering in place. That certainly describes all of our residents right now, right? They're in their rooms, in their little apartment. They can't go out to communal dining or do activities or even out in the hallway for most purposes. Unpredictability is not knowing what's going to happen next. We don't know what's going to happen tomorrow, and even within the day, things are changing as regulations, and we learn more. So protocols change, recommendations change. So when those two variables are present, unpredictability and immobility, the vulnerability to becoming traumatized is great. And again, I keep pointing out that we're talking about residents in this webinar, but I always approach things from the lens of what about staff? This describes staff as well. So a little bit more in depth here with this idea of social isolation. It's actually, there's two issues here, social isolation and loneliness. The social isolation is the objective physical separation, literally people being quarantined in their room or to their homes. Loneliness is the subjective feeling, the subjective distressed feeling of being alone or separated. So these two can exist independently from each other, or they can exist together. So a person can be around other people and still feel lonely. A person can be alone but not feel lonely or distressed whatsoever. So we really do have to know what it is we're dealing with. Either way, when a human being, when a person loses a sense of connection and community, the perception they have of the world changes. It becomes more threatening, mistrustful, or scary. When we feel those states of distress, that is what triggers the biological defense mechanism that we all know as fight, flight, or freeze. So when our bodies and our minds tell us threat, 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 we're unsafe, the world is unsafe, our environment is unsafe, our body automatically does this. It picks fight if we think we can fight off the threat. We run away if we can't, or we freeze, we dissociate, we shut down. So I'd like to put this in context of our residents, that if a person is coming across the staff as non-compliant or combative, it could actually be that the person has engaged in a biological defense mechanism of fight. That person is struggling to regain or hold on to any semblance of being in charge or being in control. The flight response could appear to staff as resistance to care, uncooperative. It could actually be that that person is disengaging or withdrawing. In a sense, they are running away, they're fleeing. The freeze state might come across to staff as a resident who is very passive or unmotivated and does not care. And it could be that that person is simply shut down, has dissociated, and is just giving in to people in power because they can't run, they can't fight, they freeze. I really appreciated the work of Dr. Nancy Peterson, and she says that we need to identify people who are most prone to suffer from social isolation and loneliness and those who would benefit most from interventions. The interventions for social isolation may look very different from interventions for those who feel lonely. So there's two different phenomena going on here. What they do have in common are the risk factors associated with both: high blood pressure and heart disease, obesity, immune systems weakened, depression, anxiety, and cognitive decline. So all of these things, I think intuitively, we're like, oh yeah, of course social isolation would do all of these things. So what I'd like to hope or think that we're doing as staff is incorporating this in our clinical discussions, talking about when our residents are experiencing a changing condition, that we're asking questions. Are they isolated? Of course, they're isolated, but are they feeling lonely? Are they suffering ill effects related to the distress of being isolated and feeling lonely? Are they experiencing touch starvation? In other words, skin hunger? Literally, when physical contact is limited or eliminated, we can experience touch starvation. So instinctively, as people, we want to touch people, we want to hold and hug and caress, and we can't do that right now. And there's incredible fear around that. And that starvation increases our stress and depression, anxiety, and what that does is triggers the defense mechanism. So really what's happening is that people are in a constant state of arousal, of anxiety. Okay, our bodies are saying threat, threat, threat. It's constant, right? It's around us, it's in our communities, it's every time we as staff go out of our homes, go into work. So all of these things impact our physical well-being, our physiological well-being, and can also lead to post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. And even if it's not diagnosable PTSD according to that criteria, it could still be PTSD-like symptoms. So in my work across the country here, I've been having some dialogues in various groups, and we've been talking about, you know, when the pandemic, I'm not even sure the right language in here, ends, stops, goes away, do we believe that once we can touch, hug, and hold the people, do we believe that the negative effects of isolation are just going to disappear? I don't think I do, because the fear that has literally been ingrained into us and for survival purposes, it's not just going to go away. So I think we need to be considering as nursing home staff, what is it going to look like when we can eventually re-enter and re-engage in whatever normal society looks like next? I do like this quotation from Dr. Mochtinger, and he says, my framework for thinking about this is that there are two pandemics, one caused by the virus and the other caused by the trauma and stress associated with the pandemic. He makes the analogy of a natural disaster after which we see increased morbidity and mortality, depression, anxiety, suicide. All of these things happen after natural disasters. The pandemic is no exception. The pandemic still can see increases in all of these. And I'd like us to think, you know, as the weeks and months go on, years perhaps, the people that we receive that come to be with us for post-acute care or to live in nursing homes could actually be suffering from these as well. He talks about there's a predictable second wave of death after exposure to mass trauma. So knowing all of this, what do we do today? How do we mitigate the effects of trauma and social isolation? Well, one of the things, if you're not already doing, is screening for trauma. This is a screening tool. I personally recommend that the National Work Group of Trauma-Informed Care that I've been participating in for a couple of years, This is probably the one that I think most of my colleagues would recommend as well. It's the primary care PTSD screen. It's a 5-question questionnaire, and this is a screen, folks. It is not an assessment. So when we screen residents and they come up that it's indicated that, yes, they're experiencing trauma, the next step is we have to have a plan in place to do a further assessment, to get treatment plan in place. So we need to be intentional about these sorts of tools, that if we begin doing any kind of screening, we have to know what comes next. We have to have follow-up action steps, protocols, and policies. The same with this tool. This is a tool a colleague of mine, courtesy of Dr. Barbara Ganzel. It's a supplement to the tool I just showed you. So basically what this one does, it's looking at the current symptoms, the signs and symptoms of post-traumatic stress according to these categories. So look there on the left, it's possible delayed emotional reactions, physical, cognitive, behavioral, and existential. So as we consider how do we talk about these things, what do we do as staff, how do we incorporate this into our clinical operations, our day-to-day work? You know, one of the things you can do is copy and paste this and create a worksheet out of it. It can be used as a direct screening tool where we talk with residents and ask if they're experiencing any of these things, because not all of these things are on that other tool I just showed you, the PC-PTSD-5. So this is a supplement. It can be used as an indirect screening tool as well. If you notice there on the right-hand side where it says source. So if the resident is not cognitively capable of answering these questions, perhaps a staff member or eventually families can be able to help. But again, please don't introduce something like this until we have training in place. We know what we're going to do with this information, where will it be housed, how does it incorporate into the care plan. So we have to work it into our workflow. We need to be talking about the unmet needs. We need to be asking residents about this. I also believe that staff, my work is a lot with staff now as well. So considering the unmet needs and incorporating this again into our work and our clinical and discussions generally speaking about residents and what they're experiencing. So here's one of my favorite resources lately. This is from the cupofempathy.com. The creator of this tool is Marianne Van Dyke. She is a nonviolent communication expert and trainer. This is a free download. Go to that website, you can get it. If you'll notice this side here, it says needs. So as human beings, we all have all of these needs in all of these categories. On the back side of this tool are these categories. So notice on the left, the first 3 columns are feelings when my needs are fulfilled. On the right, you'll notice the little orange or yellowish colored line at the top. These are the feelings when my needs are not fulfilled. So think about the residents in your facility right now. If their needs are not fulfilled, are they feeling pain, wretched, lonely, hurt, hopeless, powerlessness, panic, overwhelmed, irritable, anxious, startled? Look at all of those on the right. Now, when they are fulfilled, are they feeling amused, joyous, open-hearted, bright, calm, refreshed? So it gives us the words around, like that little guy in the beginning, the curiosity part. This is the languaging around the unmet needs, the emotions that maybe many of us didn't have training in the beginnings of our careers. Social isolation needs to be included in ongoing disaster planning. This was a huge point that I've been making lately, that the distress of the pandemic, it isn't going to just stop when the pandemic ends, whatever it looks like in the next year or whenever. I don't even know the time frame. So we need to be adopting and sustaining a culture of trauma-informed care, of which looking at the experience of social isolation and loneliness is part of it. So we need to be problem solving as we re-enter community life, community or life as usual. What might be some issues and challenges? The lingering effects of these sorts of traumatic experiences and the fears. What do we need to be prepared for? I will always try to incorporate things into a lens of process improvement, not just performance, but process improvement. The tasks, the things that we do day to day. So process improvement around trauma-informed care. I'd love to see task forces in each of the facilities, and it's not just one person or department. It includes lots of different people, lots of departments, families, of course, and residents. One idea could be around the video technology, video calls. So obviously most facilities are doing this sort of intervention right now, but if you were to take it a step further, if you were to actually think of all the steps and the processes that go into facilitating a successful video call, what would that process look like? What's the process in your facility as it is right now? When a resident wants to make a video call to a family, how does it work? What's the first step? Who does what, when, and how? What's the oversight? What devices? How do you clean them? What are the barriers? What works? What happens if a staff member is facilitating like this in the picture, and all of a sudden the resident becomes agitated, or the family doesn't know what to ask anymore? They don't know they don't know what questions to ask. What are the conversations to start to help focus on rewarding experiences, to be able to name the grief and the sadness, but also to have movement towards smiles and laughter and new shared experiences? What does staff do if the resident becomes distressed or confused? So when you think about the process, it's not just clicking Zoom, opening it up, and here's your wife, your daughter, your son, your partner, whoever. It's the whole process around it. So I think there's room for improvement and to really maximize what staff are already doing so very well. For me, it comes down to this, is that the pivotal change we are talking about must be ingrained culture change, not just adding a screening tool to a list of tasks or putting a generic care plan on the chart. We need sustainable culture change, not just the culture of the pandemic. So in closing, I want to introduce you to someone that I've recently learned about, Mickey Scott B. Jones, and she's known as the Justice Doula. She wrote a beautiful piece called Invitation to Brave Space. And I'd like to leave this webinar with this poem for you. And I hope that you take this poem and you share it with your staff and think about the culture and the space that you're creating in your own facility. Because truly it is all about staying connected and showing up. Invitation to Brave Space by Mickey Scott B. Jones. Together we will create brave space, because there is no such thing as safe place. We exist in the real world. We all carry scars and we have all caused wounds in this space. We seek to turn down the volume of the outside world. We amplify voices that fight to be heard elsewhere. We call each other to more truth and love. We have the right to start somewhere and continue to grow. We have the responsibility to examine what we think we know. We will not be perfect, and this space will not be perfect. It will not always be what we wish it to be, but it will be our brave space together. And we will work on it side by side. To all of you on this webinar and all the people in your facilities, with all of my heart, I extend my deepest gratitude and thanks that we continue to be safe as much as we can, to continue to do this work that we all love around nursing homes. And I look forward to coming through this on the other end and hopefully soon being able to see people in person again. Thank you for your time.
Hey, Dr. Jurevich, I made it on, so I can continue us on if you'd like.
Oh, good. Yeah, I was talking while I was on mute, so perfect. So thank you. I was just saying I was going to hand off to you. Thank you.
All right. So we just have a couple of ideas here from the American Healthcare Association and National Center for Assisted Living, of ideas of ways to engage residents at this time during the pandemic. And so we'll just kind of go through some of these. And if you think of things that you've done at your facilities, please chat them in. Next slide. So they have the idea of the virtual trip through the museum, and there's several different museums that are doing this. Local museums, I'm sure, are too, but Museum of Modern Art and the Chicago Institute of Art are a couple that you can get on and do virtual trips. Next slide. religious services, which I'm guessing you are doing and helping residents do, but certainly there's any pick of local versus the big community churches that are broadcasting. Some are live and some are recorded that you can just get on and help them watch. Next slide. Apparently you can catch up Night at the Operas. And I know a lot of the orchestras are doing things, as well as other musical groups will have kind of live virtual concerts. So I think those are opportunities as well. Next slide. They had some ideas of doing homemade radio hour, so that where you're reading a short story and transmitting it over the intercom, or getting community is involved so that the residents are helping tell the stories. Next slide. Asking the community to submit stories, cards, photos, letters to be shared. Intercom bingo. I think we've had some groups that have done things like this. Residents writing or reporting what they're thankful for and then sharing them with the community. And then families sending photos and mementos to create scrapbooks. Having theme days, the country or state, such as a country or state, and serve the thematic food. So, the Mexican hat here and having Mexican food. Solo dancing aligned to music associated with the theme. What do we got? Somebody chimed in here. Pen pal with local kids. I like that one because I think it's always good to engage children with our older adults, and we can learn from each other. Remote model car races. I know a couple communities have done. What else have you seen? I know we showed that video on Facebook, I think, about the residents that were using the Nerf guns or the Nerf bow and arrow or something to get the deers at Christmas time. Or the reindeer, I guess they were. Anybody else have things that they've done in their nursing homes just to get people engaged?
Dr. Dahl, this is Kelly. I know I mentioned on one of our groups before, but I'm not sure if it was this one or not. But whenever I was in a facility, we used to have themed parades for the residents. And we would team up and dress up in costumes, and the staff would just wander around the facility, play music overhead, just something different to make it exciting for them. So in this situation, they could sit at their door and will still be socially distanced and still have some entertainment.
All right, I like that. We have another involving elementary school students reading to their residents using FaceTime. So I think that's awesome. Happy hours.
Yeah, I was going to say that the facility that I was associated with a while back, we implemented soup rounds. And so we had a mid-afternoon cart go around offering different styles of soup. So, went from mild, creamy to spicy. So that was, gave some residents some choice, and it helped with the hydration status.
You got to have some other good ideas out there that we can share.
And something I would add too, if you're going room to room with your carts, I know that most people have some sort of activity cart where you pass out books or games or whatever you have on your activity cart. Just make sure you're disinfecting and sanitizing before you take it to the next room. But those are always a good way to give them a variety of ideas, as Dr. Juravich mentioned with the soup, but a variety of ideas of items to do.
Yeah, I'd get on this hot chocolate cart that someone mentioned. I would choose that over the soup, Dr. J. Let's see, dedicated TV channel for in-house activities. So they can have somebody in the activity room and then distribute it to the individual rooms over the TV channel. That would be pretty cool. A flavored water and snack cart.
think some of you guys have mentioned too that with the dedicated TV channel that you can do like a Jeopardy or some kind of game show. Each person can watch it in their rooms and then somehow respond in. I think that was mentioned on one of our calls before.
You could also do a little kind of in the room exercise in their chair with that maybe too.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, exercise and bingo on the TV channel. Perfect.
I was going to mention that I recall at a presentation once where somebody had mentioned that the most popular video game in long-term care was the Indianapolis 500 race car game. And when asked, they actually surveyed residents. They said, "Well, why do you like the video game?" And they said, "Well, they gave up their driver's license a long time ago, so it was very refreshing for them to get back into the seat again and drive the car." Crash or no crash.
Yeah, and I think a lot of facilities have Wii's in place that their therapy services use. And if you do, you could even set up like a tournament style competition, and then you wouldn't have multiple people in the area at one time. You just have the two. They can be socially distanced, do their competition, and then bring the next person in. And maybe even for those of you who have the dedicated TV channel, play it live. Everyone can watch the tournament in their rooms.
All right. Keep putting in your answers, but we'll kind of move on to quality improvement case. Kelly, you're doing that?
Yes, and actually, if you don't mind, I want to share my screen really quick. I filled in yesterday for another group, and there was a slide that I really liked, and I want to show you guys, and I really think we've kind of touched on it today. So something that we've been talking about here is all of these opportunities to improve the residents' situation during this pandemic. And I think more times than not, we always focus on the problem opposed to looking at opportunities. And this particular image is just a tree, obviously, but on this tree, whatever's at the root feeds the rest of the tree. So if you're looking at the problem, you're looking at fear, disrespect, silos, information control, or some examples of the roots, and that just turns into, you know, your turnover and low morale, etc. If you look at it as an opportunity, if we're talking, this particular example is talking about communication, but if you are, if there's openness and transparency when you're communicating with the staff, with families, with residents, and respecting their opinions, their input, and we're looking more at an opportunity, then you will then produce and yield more or happier residents, better customer service, teamwork. So I think as we go through just the day-to-day things that may arise, opposed to just solely focusing on it as a problem, try to look at, you know what, here's an opportunity for improvement. But I really liked that slide whenever I did that yesterday, and so I thought I would share it with you guys. I know it wasn't on our list there.
So Kelly, can I just interject here and just kind of give a shout out to Dr. Dahl in a sense that in our clinic, we look at kind of psychological wellness or well-being through food. And so we've had intermittent and random opportunities to do anything from bringing in for the staff pizza, sandwiches. We had a Starbucks coffee round one time. So a lot of what do they call those frappa lattes or whatever. And so it's just that, you know, that kind of variation, but using gestures of what do I say, expression of thank you through food, I think is very, very valuable.
Absolutely. And, you know, and it's not just, oh, I've got some nourishment, but I'm saving time to have, rather than running out to go get something or whatever. It's showing that you're being considerate of the time that they have spent. So today we've been talking about social isolation and loneliness for residents. And in order for us to address social isolation and loneliness for residents, we first have to make sure that our staff are in a good space. And so I go back to something that we talked about quite a few weeks ago, which is psychological PPE. You can go next. Thank you. And, during this pandemic, the staff have taken on more responsibilities, more risk by going into a COVID positive unit, and also heartaches because they've really lost a lot of residents or family members on a personal level. And so I think it's very important that we look at psychological PPE again and make sure that as leadership in the facility, that you're doing everything in your power to help maintain that their mental health and mental well-being. So I think we have a quick poll, Julie. Just curious what you guys have done during this pandemic to address that. And I think it's only one question. Yeah. And I'm not going to read through these. Like I said, we have went through them before. I just wanted to just do a quick reminder on why that is important. How are we coming along there, Julie?
We're not quite at half. We're at about 40%. So you let me know what you think.
Yeah, we'll give it just a couple more minutes. I wanted to also say that for those of you who haven't shared any ideas in chat, please continue to share opportunities or suggestions of what has worked well for you to keep the residents engaged. That I found on the video is very interesting, the touch starvation. And if those residents are truly struggling because they're not able to touch and feel, see their family members, try to think of an opportunity. What could be put in place to assist with that? Excuse me. And could it be that the staff help fill some of that gap? So here the majority definitely have talked about defining roles for staff and leadership. I think that's important because it opens those communication lines. You know who to talk to, when to talk to them, and designate those duties. Buddy system, Dr. Jarovich talks about a buddy system a lot, and it's very important to have that partner. You just look at it and just in life in general, you always have your partner or your buddy or your sidekick, and I think it's important in the workplace as well. And peer support services, I've talked about this before too. If you have an employee assistance program or something that can be anonymous where staff can reach out and have their voice heard and talk through things with a counselor. And definitely training the managers to be aware and know where to provide opportunities. I'm sure opportunities for time off is not an easy one. So I think that's great that some of you have been able to do that. Okay, we can go to the next slide. Going back to resident loneliness. Now that you've evaluated your staff and they're healthy in a mental health space, then how do we make sure that the staff are able to participate in improving patient loneliness and isolation? And this particular slide is just a very simple flow chart just to illustrate how first you have to determine if there is resident loneliness. And I'm sure based on the pandemic, there probably is some. Determine what their needs would be. Try out your interventions and then evaluate success. And this is very simply put a performance improvement plan, right? You're going to determine what you need to do, and then at the end, you're evaluating success. We'll go to the next slide. And the first, so let's consider creating a PIP on resident quality of life and focus on loneliness to improve there. And the first step to any PIP before you put one in place is to determine if there is an issue. And so we're going to talk about a few ways to look and determine if there is a resident loneliness, determine if that exists. You can go to the next slide. So newspapers, medical reports, as well as residents and families have expressed concerns during this pandemic and that the residents are sheltering in place. And I'm sure you've all experienced some of that with your families and residents. And do you know how many of your residents do experience some form of loneliness, and how would you determine that? We'll go to the next slide. This just goes back to our simple flow chart. You start to determine if there's a process. You can ask the 5 questions that I reference a lot, the who, how, what, when, where, to your staff to determine if there is. And using loneliness, how will you determine if a resident loneliness, and what tool can you use to make that determination? So this goes back to the tool. Do you have an assessment tool to determine loneliness? And if so, could you utilize that? Do you feel like it would really cover all of the bases? If not, then maybe you need to do some more research to determine what tool could be used. And I have a sample on the next slide in just a minute. And limit the resident population. We say again, make sure you're testing and viewing this on a small group. You don't want to overwhelm your resources, your staff, by performing this. And you will just need a small group to test the change to determine if that is appropriate. This also says here that you don't necessarily want to test the residents with dementia because they may not be able to communicate as well. And if you do have a tool, make sure you're teaching the staff how to use the tool whenever you're doing it. And if you have identified loneliness as an area for improvement, and you're creating your own checklist or your own assessment, we would love for you to share those tools with your peers. The last item I would have is make sure that you're communicating to the staff if line staff have participated in creating this tool. We talk a lot about building up your employees or your line staff to empower them to participate in performance improvement overall. And if they have been assisting in creating a new tool, then you want to make sure you share that. It just further shows that they are where their value is and how valuable they are to your organization. The next slide, you can go ahead and go to the next slide. The next slide is UCLA's loneliness scale. So here is an example of a tool that you can use. And I'm going to see Dr. Juravich, do you have any points on this? I know you shared this one before we go to sample root cause.
Not a lot to say other than this is one of the more standard tools. And one of the points is that you can select maybe 4 or 5 questions out of this. I mean, the validation of the tool is that you do the entire thing, but this needs to be applied to people that are cognitively intact. So people with early dementia would be okay, but people that have moderate to severe dementia, probably not so okay. And that's why I mentioned in the chat box that you can use the what's called the neuropsych inventory for Alzheimer's patients to get at their sort of behaviors and emotions. And the idea is that you use this tool as a pre-intervention. So you get a survey and you find out, what the people's responses are, and you say, okay, we have 15% of the population that we studied, let's say 20 of our residents. I don't know, 4 of them expressed loneliness. So then, that represents, a 20% or whatever of the population. Then you do your intervention, whatever it is, and then you come back and do the same survey again. So it's just, you use the survey as a tool to measure your success or lack of it. So not having an impact is part of the process. Say, well, that didn't work so good, so we got to try something else. So that's kind of the point of using these measurable surveys.
Absolutely. Thanks, Dr. Juravich. And when Dr. Juravich mentioned that you use this tool to measure initially and then use it again after you've put an intervention in place. And how do we determine what intervention would be the best practice? Is we need to do a root cause analysis to really determine what the root cause of their loneliness is. So I'm going to have Michelle share her screen, if that's okay, to pull up a fishbone diagram. And I know we did this last week, and really would love any input that folks have on why we believe that resident loneliness exists. I think one of the overarching issues is that we're in the middle of this pandemic and they're not getting as much interaction with their families and their loved ones. But what else could you guys think of that would trigger this loneliness? Because that will help you determine what interventions to put in place. And I'm going to pull up the chat really quick to see if we have anybody chatting in. Because when we say the news and the medical reports come up, and that could indicate a reason for loneliness. If it's someone that is become more depressed or more anxious because they're continuously watching the news and they're seeing all of these negative reports, try to find something else for them to be involved in during that time, so they're not constantly seeing the negativity or the media. Cold weather, Karen says, news, overall attitude from everyone, and missing their routine. I can tell you, for those of you, you all know I'm in Texas. I'm not used to the cold weather. And talk about no routine. My children have been here locked in the house with me since Thursday, and we are all struggling with no routine right now. But cold weather, you can think about, if cold weather is contributing to that, have that hot chocolate cart that goes around that may warm them up, or the soup cart, overall attitude of everyone. Look at your psychological PPE for your staff. If the attitudes of the staff are starting to turn the residents too. And then if it is a routine issue, see what you need to do to put a routine back into their schedule, right? Decrease in resident vocalization or conversation. Yeah, I've mentioned before that the residents and the staff are almost as if they are family, right? And so if you can provide that opportunity for the staff to take more one-on-one time with the residents, maybe they come in for their shift 10 minutes earlier than normal and go have some one-on-one time with those residents. Yeah, the news definitely can be a trigger, so cancel that channel. Right. Anybody else have anything? Dr. Dahl, Jean, Faye?
So I was gonna, I put in the chat box, just the idea of using surveys by email. So if you have staff email, you can use what we use a Qualtrics survey, but I guess you could use Monkey survey. There's different things that you can use to just create a quick questionnaire to survey staff about issues of either social isolation, depressed mood, and so forth. And then you could develop, based on that information, you can use that as a pre-intervention. So you could set up a PIP related to staff, enhancement of staff mood and disposition. And so that might be through, for example, that you have like these food offerings or raffles, things that anything. We'll be talking about that next time, about some of the interventions that we can deal with, focused on staff in particular.
Yeah, and Jean put here in the chat too, a change in appetite or lack of interest in food can definitely be a red flag for loneliness as well. And it just goes back to that first slide that we showed about the psychological PPE. I jokingly said on the call I was filling in for yesterday, the old saying, happy wife, happy life. Well, if the staff are unhappy, then that definitely rolls over to the residents. And it's very important that you take care of those that are taking care of the residents in the facility. And so really, it may not be drilling down on what the loneliness or the issues are with the residents as much as it is drilling down and getting to the root cause of what the issues are with the staff and how to turn that around.
Yeah, I was going to mention in a very interesting conversation and a moment of revelation was I was talking to a chief medical officer of a healthcare facility in the country here, and we had some exchanges and discussions early on in the year, and then we circled back, and he said, he says, I got to apologize for my behavior from last time. He says, I didn't realize how stressed out I was by this pandemic. He says, it wasn't until I took a week off that I realized, what all had accumulated. So I think just to remind us all that we don't, while we trudge through, like the Brits, we keep our chin up. A lot of times we don't really recognize how much stress has accumulated. And I think, just, recognizing that and being able to offer, particularly in staff, some relief valves for that pent up stress is so important. And particularly true for those people that are doing like double shifts and so forth. Boy, I really feel for them because, not only do they have the emotional exhaustion, but they have the physical exhaustion of their, sleep disruption and just, burning the candle at both ends.
Absolutely. Some people may just seasonally, this may affect them to go through these downfalls. And if you know your staff well enough and you can relate to that and allowing them that opportunity to release that in some way or another would be helpful to them.
Yeah.
When you recognize it, say you have a moment, go take your moment to, to recollect or do what you need to do to overcome it. But that's about understanding your staff and understanding their needs as well as the residents' needs. You need care plans for staff just as much as you need care plans for residents. And I know to most people, it sounds like just more work, but when you truly understand your staff and their needs, then it makes it a happier culture or happier environment to work in.
Yeah, and I was just going to add, as folks get to know me, you'll find I just have a lot of creative ideas, and I'll just blurt them out. They don't always necessarily make sense, but so for example, if you did a survey and found out that a quarter or 10% of the staff had depressive feelings. You might think about that and say, well, during the winter months here, particularly in the Dakotas, in Minnesota, we've got pretty much a long dark cycle, because it gets dark early. And so you get these seasonal affective disorders. And so maybe just installing bright light therapy for 30 minutes in the morning for the staff might be an intervention that you might want to test and then later see, a couple of weeks later, if that improved the survey for the, for the mood. So that's an example of another PIP using bright light therapy for staff intervention in mood disorders associated with the pandemic and seasonal affective disorders. So again, just a crazy idea, but something that could be tested.
Yeah, and another thought I have is, how we do these polls when we're going through this program, if there's a way to do a poll for your staff, just everybody submit one thing that makes you happy or one thing that lifts your spirits, and really kind of consolidate those responses and see if you can really incorporate those into your daily activities with your employees. And, I used to tell staff during orientation that, a smile goes a very long way when someone is having a rough day. And I think that too often we get so busy and overstressed that it's hard to even muster that up. But it really does change the culture of your facility if you try to continue to promote that positive spirit.
Yeah, that's a good point, Kelly. It's something that I've noticed, for instance, in our clinic, so we get monthly reports from patient evaluations of the providers, and most of them are like, 90% or better, very good comments. And then those get shared with the group, and, we kind of celebrate the expression of gratitude that the patients have. So, certainly comments from the residents and sharing those, or family members, recognizing staff in general. You can align the commentaries to particular individuals, but you can just also make them anonymous and say, this is all the positive feedback that we got from the staff. And to have a poster board in the front as staff walk in would be a way to, recognize that. So I'm going to hand it off back to you, Dr. Dahl, for the summary.
Sure. I was just going to say in our office also, we just have a whiteboard and we are picking a person of the week and everybody's just writing things that they like about that person or and so it's nice just to let everybody know we like you and this is why, and so that's been fun. And since we've started that, we also have had the idea of maybe having a person of the week who has to bring in their high school photo, because that we thought that would be funny and entertaining as well. So just some other ideas. Let's see. So today we talked about different PDSA cycles of change to test tools. We have the loneliness scale. We showed a couple of those, I think, last week as well. So there's definitely tools out there to assess loneliness and to assess for post-traumatic stress disorder and pre-post-traumatic stress, things that we're finding because of the pandemic sets us up for it. So how can we incorporate resident voices into improvement of social engagement? Can we survey our residents? Can we see what makes them happy, what things that they enjoy? Get reports from the family so that we can incorporate those things in our residents' lives. And how can we create patient-centered social engagement activities? So I think loneliness is probably always an issue in the nursing home, and it's just been heightened by the pandemic and how isolated we've become. So loneliness is certainly out there, and it, like we said last week, it can contribute to increased infection, weight loss, dementias, declines. So it's a big deal, and we should be looking for it and trying to come up with creative ways to intervene.